You're listening to Nabbit, Nestor and Pilgrim in the Tumult, an altered TCG podcast. Whoa. Oneroi, would you please help? Like, now? I mean, I can't hold on much long. Whoa! Okay, well, there goes the camp I spent all day building. At least the hammock is still here. Thanks for saving me, Pilgrim. Maybe it isn't the smartest thing, hitching a long-distance ride on the back of a Leviathan. It's headed east, though, and seems to resist or warp the tumult. Why not shelter here? Other than losing your camp over the edge when it makes a particularly bumpy pass over some tumult-spawned lampart the size of a small mountain, I guess. Is that one shaped like a garden gnome? It looks like it was made from balloons. This thing, the Leviathan, is the size of a mountain. Or its shell is, anyway. It is a massive snail. Its spiraled shell is pocked with craters and carved with scars, and some of these gouges hold glowing water that tastes like sugared berries and mint. Trees grow on the back of this thing, and it seems to sustain its own ecosystem of creatures that fly and cling. There are even goats here, shepherded by a stoic frogman who holds a crooked staff and says nothing. He just blinks when I try to talk to him. I have heard him ribbit to the goats, though. Perhaps when he did not realize I was nearby. The Leviathan's name is Philibus. I know this because I have named it. I have been to the front of this shell, but have not yet braved the slinking slug bridge that is the fleshy part of this beast. I know not if its eye stalks have seen me, or if it knows I am here. It just goes and trails this etheric sludge behind it. I guess I will rebuild my camp, and maybe see if the frog has any goat's milk. Last time, before Philibus broke the horizon, I was talking about the Faction Tournament being held in Asgartha prior to the Solstice Gate opening ceremony, which will mark the beginning of the Tumult exploration phase of the rediscovery endeavor. The tournament happened across 4 days, and there was a different competition held each day. Day 1. Each day opened with the Exalt champions representing their faction on stage. On days 2, 3, and 4, the faction tournament standings were also raised at this point, but on day 1, the Exalt champions were simply introduced, and the event of the day was explained. As a reminder, Axiom was represented by Sierra and Oddball. Bravos was represented by Kojo and Buddha. Muna was represented by Tasia and Nara. Ordis was represented by Sigismar and Wingspan. Izmir was represented by Acacia and Taru. But Lyra? What a mess. It was supposed to be represented by Auraq and Kibble, but that didn't happen. Instead, Nevenka, of all people, was Lyra's champion. Did she kidnap Auraq and stuff her in a closet? Did she poison Auraq's food? Auraq is definitely the kind of person who would have wanted the spotlight, and Nevenka is absolutely the kind of person who would have pulled something so that she couldn't have it. Nevenka is a trickster. She's a bit unhinged, and, if I'm being honest, she's not well liked in Asgartha. She was banned from her clan, and has engendered very little goodwill with all her graffiti and antics. I think it says a lot about a person to be banned from an organization like one of the tribes of Lyra. What did she do? Or what didn't she do? I wonder. Maybe this was some kind of Lyra subterfuge beyond just Nevenka. Or maybe it was a compromise between the 9 matriarchs. Maybe this was somehow an Ordis slight against Lyra's leadership. The Ordis were the faction tournament's organizers. However it happened, Auraq was not there on stage and Nevenka was, looking bored? She looked bored up there, purple fingernail digging fair food tooth crud from the grooves of her molars. The champions were introduced, and the day's first event was explained by an Ordis man in a blue shirt with a strong voice. I guess you would call him a referee, or perhaps a judge. His voice would be tested in the days to come, as crowds roared and booed and laughed. "The first day," he shouted, "of the faction tournament will have our champions competing in the time-tested alteration duel challenge of permanence." This is a challenge where alterers root an idea in the world so strongly that their opponents can't influence it. Or at least that's the idea. That's how you win. Only 2 champions managed to shape something that the other 4 couldn't manage to change. Tasia and Nara of the Muna was one. This was not a surprise. This kind of activity is a strength of the Muna, whose alteration style is Anam, the close study and use of mana, the substance that binds and fortifies ideas to the world. The other was Sigismar and Wingspan of the Ordis. So the 2 ended up facing each other at sunset in an arena already used by the paint spray starflame machinery that tore at the ground and was torn from it by the exalts of all factions. The blue-shirt judge shouted for them to begin, and Tasia immediately fell into a cross-legged meditative stance, eyes closed. Nara wrapped his gigantic fox body around her to obscure what she was doing from Sigismar, who smirked as he unsheathed his sword and began carving Heka script into the ground as Wingspan climbed into the sky for an angle. Heka is the Ordis alteration style. The Ordis believe so thoroughly that language, words, contain the very ideas they signify that their writing of a thing manifests it. Almost finished with a glyph, the crowd could see Sigismar close his eyes for a moment, presumably to get better visibility from Wingspan's eyes above. He made a last-second adjustment to a stroke, and in a flash the text rose up from the ground, a medium-sized pyramid, ostensibly a small-scale replica of the top half of the monolith, Ordis's bastion, with the second half of the diamond-shaped structure heavily struck deep into the ground of the arena. At once, Tasia and Nara sprung from their huddled space, both splitting to flank Sigismar and his pyramid. They left behind a simple wooden table. It's hard to tell, through the Gestalt, what ideas these things really held in them. Sigismar's pyramid seems straightforward. The set ideas Ordis holds to are tightly bound up in the monolith, the diamond structure that floats in the sky above Arcaster. The top half of the diamond is referred to as the sanctum, and holds within it, truly, the knowledge of Asgartha. The bottom half of the diamond is called the anthill, and it is a busy structure swarming with bureaucrats, paper pushers, managers, accountants, and the perpetually stressed masses of a community that lives deadline to deadline and has a hard time seeing beyond the current quarter end. They are 2 pyramids that operate at different speeds but work to the same end, the orderly structure of society. Tasia's table could mean so many things, but I think it meant something like family or friends united. I think that because of what Sigismar did. Wingspan collapsed on Nara before it could reach the pyramid. Tasia had unsheathed the thought blades I so respect her for, and was running At the fleet-footed speed of a woodland creature, her whole body angled to the ground and exuding intent to cut something from the pyramid. Perhaps the very notion of walls, of barriers. Tasia was the favorite to win this event. She was Muna. Her idea would be solid, rooted into the earth like the world tree itself. It kind of was, even. The legs of the table, you could tell, reached into the ground, each like rooted trunks. But before she could reach Sigismar's alteration, the butt of the lance of an Ordis recruit with long black hair connected with her stomach. A recruit named Nosk seemed to come out of nowhere. He was hard to find, even with the entire audience scanning the arena for him. The recruit Eidolon was pulled into being by Sigismar before he had completed the pyramid and while Tasia's vision was blocked by Nara's body. While the alteration duel challenge of martial confrontation would be held later, it was not technically against the rules of the persistence challenge to use force when attempting to influence your opponent's alteration. And force did Sigismar use. While Nosk slowed Tasia down with a forceful blow, and while Wingspan pinned Nara, Sigismar threw his sword with altered force, a hexaglyph glowing on his right pauldron, and at the base of the blade itself it shot from the man so fast that none but those naturally blessed with horomancy would see the blade spin through the air. At once, the table Tasia left behind was split, and somehow Sigismar changed the idea of the thing from something to do with unity to something to do with opposition. Trouble at the family table, perhaps. The crowd was stunned silent for a moment, and Tasia, who had resumed her sprint after sidestepping Nosk, slowed to a trot, and then a slack-shouldered stance of defeat and disbelief. Sigismar had won this duel, not by making something immutable, but by changing something by force, and doing it quickly. At once, the audience erupted, some with cheers, and some with simple shouts of shock and question. The blue-shirted judge called the match in Sigismar's favor, but few could hear the man at that point. Day 2. The day began the same, with stage introductions to the champions. Ordis was announced to have the lead. It was a new day, and the crowd was buzzing with an expectation they did not hold the day before. The blue-shirted judge announced the day's event, the Alteration Duel Challenge of Art, judged by a panel of unfactioned critics. Normally, this is Lyra's advantage. With Nevenka, though, after the previous day's upset, people did not have such a set expectation for the outcome. The event was wholly less action-packed than the previous day, and you could tell some of the adrenaline-focused spectators were bored and disappointed. The event ended up drawing a different kind of excited crowd. Akesha treated the audience to a starry fireworks show. It was well received by the crowd, but was scored low by the critics, and she ended up coming in last. She also received last in the first day, and you could tell she was visibly upset by the rating she got from this event, especially because of how high her spirits were lifted by the crowd's reaction. Kojo did a fire-eating, juggling, and hot air balloon routine that would earn him 4th place for the day, the lowest position he would come in all of the events. Tasia transformed the entire stadium into a beautiful garden, but ultimately lost 2nd place to Sierra's best placement of the tournament, which she earned with the construct-assisted shadow puppetry play she conducted. Her father, Ephron, was in the audience, and was brought to great, loving sobs, so much to the point that Sierra leapt into the stands to embrace him after taking her bow. Nevenka did not feature any work of art inside the stadium. Instead, while the other exiles were performing and presenting their works, she was busy painting the outside of the stadium with a cartoon of her own face, tongue out and finger pulling down her right eyelid. Impressive to have accomplished so much in the span of a few hours, but ultimately the critics gave her a rating that earned Nevenka 5th place in what was supposed to be her best event. To Asgartha's surprise, Sigismar and Wingspan took 1st place again, in the challenge of art. How? He read a story, written in Heka, and brought it to life for all to be there for. It was about Rune before Asgartha was founded. Rune as explorer and adventurer, braving the tumult to find a better place for his people. The final scene depicted Rune standing there, next to Sigismar, where the stadium they stood in would be built. Rune was looking around at empty, unbuilt land and breathing in the air of a new place, a stable place, a shelter, a home. Sigismar's story brought the crowd with him and reminded them what they were doing with the rediscovery endeavor. The critics afforded him perfect scores. Day 3. Halfway through the tournament. Blue shirt judge on stage. Faction champions introduced. Stakes outlined. If Sigismar and Ordis take first today, they will be the top faction champions. There has been too much flux in the lower standings for any one faction to unseat Ordis with 3 first-place victories. Muna, Bravos, and Axiom all still stand a decent chance of securing second at this point. Izmir and Lyra were aligning to the final 2 slots. The event this day will not be the third flavor of Alteration Duel, the Martial Challenge. Instead, the champions will participate in an alt-run competition, a race emphasizing the use of alteration. Kojo and Buddha are favored. After all, Kojo made a name for himself in alt-run competitions, and Buddha is a chimera cheetah, fast in its own right. Tasia can graft the idea of speed to Nara and ride the giant fox. Wingspan and Blotch can fly, so Sigismar and Nevenka will have an advantage clearing high obstacles. Sierra has prosthetic legs, but knows how to use them. Acacia and Taru, who is an octopus, were not favored to win, nor did they. They ended up placing last. It was interesting, though. She took to the starting line with a determination and stood proud. I expect that her sister Kumari spoke with her the night before and said encouraging words. It is not about winning, but about representing. I am proud of you regardless. Something like that. The alt-run track started inside the stadium, circled around it, went beneath it, over it, and then there was a straight dash line along the rampart, before a return to the crowd. I don't think I mentioned this, but the stadium here was a temporary one built on the northwesternmost point of Kaer Eidos, near the Solstice Gate. A lot of temporary, and some permanent construction has taken place there in the last year in preparation for the Solstice Gate opening ceremony, for this faction tournament, and for the regular operations of the Solstice Gate and its defenses against whatever the tumult tries to send against the wall. It will be a small town in its own right, even after the ceremonies are through. The racers would complete the race only when both the Alterer and their alter ego, the Chimera, completed the race circuit back inside the stadium. It was bright when the racers lined up at the starting line. Very bright. Like the morning sun itself was interested in what would happen. The blue-shirt judge stood with the crouched runners. "Set!" he called out. The stadium breathed a single breath, and then a cannon was fired, and the race began. Kojo and Buddha took a clear lead right away, both sprinting hard on foot and making grand leaps over and off of the rock obstacles laid out. They would end up finishing both the loop inside and outside and the S-track beneath the stadium before Akesha finished the inside loop. Tasia, riding Nara, held a clear second some distance behind. Sigismar rode Wingspan and Nevenka rode Blotch. They were fighting for third and were flying just high enough so as to not need to bother with the obstacles. They would both end up passing Tasia and Nara during the stadium's outside loop. Sierra held a solid 5th place, well ahead of Acacia, but without a clear path to the rest of the pack. Before Kojo exited the stadium, the crowd had decided which racers would take 5th and 6th place. Kojo and Buddha established an even firmer lead under the stadium. Tasia would not yet fall behind. The tunnel beneath the stadium was too tight for Wingspan to fly, so the Griffin set to the ground in a much slower gallop. Blotch, however, was a serpentine dragon that flew without wings, and so Nevenka laid on him, gripped tight, and the two snaked through, establishing a clear hold on 3rd place and rapidly coming up on Tasia. In fact, wingspan was slowed down so much by the tunnel that Sierra and Oddball were able to come within sight of them inside the tunnels. Unfortunately for Sierra, the tunnels ended before she was able to catch the Ordos champion, and Wingspan pumped his feathered wings 3 times and was in the air, well into the leg of the race that went over the stadium. The aero-live platforms above the stadium were small. Not so small that Tasia's giant fox couldn't stand on them, but it was clear there was some fear of heights at play, amplified by the space that Exalt had to work with so far above the stadium, perhaps. Kojo and Buddha, wingless though they are, leapt from platform to platform, strategically altering their own floating anchor points where they identified a better race line than was available to them naturally. All those years alt-running across the roofs of Arcaster paid off well here. Still, the race lines available to something that can go in a straight line are hard to compete with. Nevenka and Blotch closed some distance, and by the time the racers left the stadium for the straightaway on the rampart, it was unclear who between them would reach the wall first. Sigismar exited the stadium in third. Heka runes began to glow on Wingspan's armor, and it became clear before he was out of sight that the Alterer had invested his alteration efforts in the straightaways. A golden light trailed the Exalt as his speed doubled. The track between the stadium and the rampart was rough, unbuilt, and intended to serve as difficult terrain reminiscent of what the Exalts would face in the coming months as they braved the tumult. The racers had free rein to take whatever line they found out there, and no Ordos relays were tracking the race at that point. The next time the audience would get word of progress was at the rampart itself, and the word was fire. Kojo and Buddha left behind them a literal trail of flame as they raced side by side, keeping pace with one another, potentially sharing speed through Avgrun alteration. They made it to the rampart first and ran straight up the wall. This is particularly impressive if you understand that the rampart has an effect on alteration. The rampart is comprised of 2 walls that protect Kelon-powered turbines that repel the tumult. Repelling the tumult often means sapping an alterer's ability to alter. For anyone other than an Exalt, the straightaway on the rampart would be simply running, not alt-running. They just wouldn't have the mana to do it. But Exalts, they're something special. That's not to say this wasn't the hardest leg of the journey for them. Just because they have more mana than most doesn't mean that they weren't up against an immense sapping force. The flames dissipated, and indeed, all that could be heard for a few moments was Kojo's shoes and the pads of Buddha's feet on the top of the wall that protects Asgartha from chaos. This peaceful scene was disrupted by Nevenka's voice, shrill and whining something about Sigismar cheating. She trailed an arcing rainbow, the light of the Bifrost, and Sigismar trailed a straight beam of gold. Sigismar was still going double speed in a straight line, but Nevenka and Blotch on the curving Bifrost were going faster. At some points, Nevenka was ahead, and then would curve away, and Sigismar would take the lead. When they both landed upon the rampart, their costly alteration was choked off, and the light faded. They were allowed to fly here, and would, but they had to be within 4 meters of the rampart, so that the sapping effects of it would remain strong. Bickering, they both took a moment for their mounts to catch their breath. This would be the hardest leg for the mana-feasting beasts. The Ordos relay atop the rampart reported back to the stadium eyes on Tasia and Nara. Sigismar, also being in tune with the gestalt that the Ordos used to relay that kind of information, picked up on this report and mounted Wingspan with urgency, leaving Nevenka mid-sentence and stoking in her a greater fury. Kojo held first for Bravos. Sigismar held second for Ordos. Nevenka held third for Lyra. Tasia held fourth for Muna. Sierra held fifth for Axiom. Akesha held sixth for Izmir. It was not expected that the top of the rampart would have a significant amount of action to relay back, and so the Ordos relays were posted sparsely. What happened next would be reported later, as it was not witnessed by any but those involved. Apparently, Nevenka had, prior to the race beginning, painted a graffiti rendition of her chimera Blotch on the rampart. It is not clear when this was done, but it was done and she used it. Something she later called a paint prison erupted from the painting of the dragon and bound Sigismar and Wingspan suddenly, slamming them into the top of the rampart. She approached laughing, with the expectation to blow past him, but he unleashed a flutter of sticky paper inscribed with Heka runes that bound her and brought her and Blotch crashing down atop the rampart. Tasia and Nara came upon them cursing and trying to free themselves from each other's traps. She may have used Anam to guard herself and Nara from any further spells, or perhaps the two simply ignored her as she passed, but the altercation atop the wall allowed her third place. Kojo and Buddha cleared the rampart, leaping down in front of the solstice gate, knee and fist on ground, in a hero pose that blossomed petals of flame about him and Buddha. With a sound of thunder, the two burst away from the wall and headed back to the stadium. Nara had begun to drag by the time it leapt down from the rampart carrying Tasia, but they did not break to breathe and kept going, following the scorched trail of the race leader. It was some time before Sigismar and Wingspan were reported at the Solstice Gate checkpoint, but they were in an apparently comfortable third. Nevenka and Blotch were not seen until Sierra and Oddball were seen as well. Sierra had apparently stopped to help unstick Nevenka, who she said was sobbing multicolored tears. The two of them were now racing for fourth place. It was unclear if Nevenka went slower along because of the kindness Sierra showed her, or if the time spent on the rampart took enough out of Nevenka and Blotch that they were severely hampered. Either way, the two of them would make it back to the stadium neck, and Nevenka would only just edge Sierra out at the last second. Kojo and Buddha placed a comfortable first place, being welcomed back into the stadium by a roaring crowd and, importantly, Kojo's former alt-running Jusaka Blaze clubmates, who were allowed down to the finish line and who embraced him with such friendship and love. I am brought warmth by it, despite being no Asgarthan myself, and not being anywhere near Asgartha. Tasia and Nara secured second, collapsing together on the finish line with less than a minute lead time on Sigismar and Wingspan. The time on the rampart may have sapped the Ortis Exalt also, because they did not come back trailing golden light, and Sigismar's yellow hair was dark with sweat. The crowd was confused as to why his uniform held pinks and greens and purples, but they would come to find out soon enough what happened on the rampart. Acacia would end up completing the race, but by the time she returned, it was dark, and the stadium had emptied of all but the cleaning crew and a few groups of friends who didn't have anywhere else to go. And Kumari. Kumari's caretakers at the cloister had wheeled her bed down to the finish line, and Acacia's sister was there, awake with arms open, smiling a sister's pride. Acacia collapsed into her sister, and the two wept tears of accomplishment and love, but also wept the wordless tears of the looming separation that weighed heavy in the center of their chests. Acacia was part of the rediscovery endeavor with Kumari's blessing and support, but it will not be easy for either of them to separate. Day 4. "Bravos could take this," the blue-shirt judge called out. "Each placement on the podium is still contested in our faction tournament. Today is the final day, and the event will be the alteration duel of martial confrontation. Today, our champions will fight." The blue-shirt judge did a good job electrifying the crowd as he introduced the faction champions. Ultimately, though, the day progressed as you might expect. The match between Sigismar and Kojo was the high point, but it happened early in the day, and Sigismar and Wingspan took the match. Many Bravos are quite skilled at one-on-one combat, but this is not an area Kojo had spent much time training. It was clear where he spent his efforts, on going fast. The Ortis, generally, are good at fighting together, but Sigismar, well, it was clear that he had to learn to fight alone when he was younger. I am sure he was bullied for being Aegis' heir. Still, To say he fought alone is not entirely fair to say. He had wingspan, and he summoned the Ordis recruit Eidolon he summoned on the first day during the Permanence Challenge with Tasia, Nosk. The standings at the end of the faction tournament were as follows. Lyra in last, Izmir in 5th, Axiom in 4th, Muna in 3rd, Bravos in 2nd, and Ordis in 1st. I still don't know what happened to Auraq, or why Nevenka was the champion of the Lyra. I will say, though, if it wasn't for her, I'm not so sure that Kojo would have won the alt-run race. It would have been a lot closer, regardless. The faction tournament was a clear success. The tension in Asgartha has slackened. The restlessness of the people was channeled and worked through in this competition. It is not long now before the Solstice Gate opening ceremony, and the attention of the society is shifting to goodbyes and to spending time with those who are leaving before they do. It is not a quiet time, but there are more smiles, more hugs, and everyone seems to be looking in the same direction. Look, I have to prepare a new camp to spend the night in. But next time, I expect the Asgarthans will be through the Solstice Gate, and the rediscovery endeavor will be underway in earnest. I'd like to talk about what I think they'll find out here. I'd like to talk about Leviathans. Thanks for listening to Nap It. If you would like to engage with others on this episode or participate in altered events such as deck-building contests, tournaments, or our very own Kalan May, consider joining the Pilgrim's Nest Discord, linked in the show notes. If you liked this episode, please share it with the first person you think of when I say the word fair food, tooth crud, or with whoever. Script, performance, and audio engineering by Justin Hicks. Produced by Justin Hicks. Special thanks to Yoshiaki Mamura, Altered's lore master, and to Equinox for bringing Altered TCG across the veil and into our world. And an extra special thanks to you for listening.